to order. All right, just a couple things to mention. Just a couple things to mention. I'm not sure I'm being heard though. Doesn't sound like Elizabeth, you can hear me. Okay. I wanted to just announce that since the last town council meeting, the council went ahead and approved administratively the appointment that I asked for Malcolm Russell Einhorn to be a member of the Archives Committee as a volunteer of special rank. It's a nomenclature term that we found through searching the internet, and for volunteers, if you can't quite get them in some kind of a official status, you can bring him on as a volunteer of special rank, and it's a common method. So thanks to the council members, and a majority vote administratively, and he is now appointed. And I'm sure we'll hear more from Phil Schulp about the archives later. I also wanted to mention, and I'm not trying to steal Andrea's thunder, but the house at 1111-2 Kenilworth did get the grass cut, and supposedly the window's covered, but I went by the other day and I could see the windows covered. I didn't see them. The grass was cut last week, right?
Yeah, it was on Thursday, the windows were boarded. Covered, so unless somebody took the windows upstairs.
Yeah,
Okay.
someone's cut the grass. Somebody else.
County.
So
Nice contractor.
I just wanted to say that, and it's also, the house is currently in what I understand a pre-foreclosure, and Andrea might want to talk about that later. So that's all I have, and if I could move to the approval of agenda, unless there are changes to the agenda.
Change is going to, for mine to delete traffic and parking and put in archives.
Put in what?
Archives?
Instead of traffic or?
Correct.
You don't want to do any traffic and parking update?
Okay, I'll add archives and traffic and parking. It's not a lot.
All right, is everybody in favor of that?
That's good.
In favor.
Fine, great.
So that's unanimous. So the agenda is approved as with the change?
Yes.
Okay. And on to the approval of minutes from the November 18th regular town council meeting. We've all had a chance to look at it. Do you have any changes?
These are the minutes. I have a question and comment, and maybe it's a change. On the stormwater task force, in the sentences that is,
Are we on the second page?
second page,
Okay.
sentence that starts with upstream of the bike path, the washout will be from that sentence. It's, the sentence says upstream of the bike path, the washout will be minimized by installing riprap. Will the erosion be minimized, or will it be eliminated? If it's eliminated, that's good. If it's minimized, it doesn't solve the problem.
You can't guarantee that it would stop it all.
I'm not asking for guarantees. It should be the engineering's best, my sense is that the engineering report or the engineering study and proposal should indicate that according to their best guess, this will eliminate the problem.
So we are referring Times minutes tonight. Was
Yeah.
that stated
Yeah,
in your notes somewhere? I don't know.
I don't have notes, I just talked off the cuff.
Right, could I suggest maybe we change it to, it could be minimized since we don't have the engineering report yet. We don't even have the written report yet, as I understand it. So we could
That,
make it,
that would work for me.
Right.
I don't want to be making a statement that is
more
either not-
definitive.
that is not, that may be inaccurate, that may be misleading, and that may be taken the wrong way or read differently by different people, and especially the homeowners.
Would you like to rewrite the sentence?
You should probably also change the term washout, because that was already done, versus erosion, which is.
Well, erosion is the issue.
Right, so you
Right.
probably.
Erosion is more accurate, because I
Right.
tell it says, I'm going to take this from here to there.
Right,
How
so
about
you
if we
probably
wrote-
want to make erosion instead of the word washout.
And I think it's important to make sure that we get the engineering company to put some credence in their recommendation by saying, we think this will solve the problem, period.
How about the erosion may be minimized by installing riprap as the solution?
I'm not as comfortable with that, because again, if we're not saying that that's the goal, then we will have
Okay,
failed.
until we have,
But we don't have the committees.
No, I understand.
So-
I think your first suggestion was
I
better.
think where to go, right?
Which was,
Can,
could be, or pending the report.
Pending review by the engineer
review and recommendation by the engineer.
of the recommendations of the Stormwater Task Force recommendations, right?
So does that come in at the beginning?
Would to that work?
So pending, I'd like somebody else to go ahead and rewrite or rewrite the sentence.
How about upstream, the erosion, I'm sorry, upstream of the bike path, the erosion should be eliminated by installing riprap.
Pending review
Then we can put-
of the task force's recommendations by the town civil engineer. I think that's where Hans is going, right?
The engineer needs to say this will solve the problem.
Well, we can't say solving the problem in this, at this point in time, so.
Then you can say the engineer's recommendation is, to maximize the possibility of eliminating the problem will be.
I like that better, Hans.
How about making it something along the lines that the committee recommended,
That'd be better.
um,
Although I wasn't at the meeting, so I can't say that for sure, but I think that would be,
right, and I was there, and Chuck did ask the committee
Okay.
for consensus on
Okay.
recommendations, but I haven't seen his report back.
right.
That was my understanding, is that
Okay.
the committee
That
did
would work.
agree to
I-
make
I'm
recommendations.
cool as long as we have.
Okay, let's have somebody write the sentence
Okay,
for us.
So, upstream of the bike path, the committee recommends installing riprap to eliminate erosion pending a review by the engineer.
Or approval by the
Yeah, that sounds
engineer.
good.
I want the engineer to endorse a position,
Okay, so
so that if there's a failure, after we
So
spend
can we-
we
$200,000,
got it.
we can say, your design was deficient, and we need to solve the problem with your help financially.
So just put pending review by the
So-
engineer, right?
Yeah,
Upstream of the bike path.
The committee
committee.
recommended installing
It's actually
riprap.
the task force.
Yeah, the task force, sorry. The task force recommended installing riprap to eliminate erosion pending review and approval by the engineer, by the town engineer.
that's good.
There.
As long as you say approval in there, that's cool.
Review and approval, or just approval? Pending approval?
Well, definitely
Review and approval by the engineer.
So you want review?
Well, it doesn't have to be, approval is the most important.
Yes, it is. Okay, one last time.
By civil engineer.
All together.
No way.
In unison?
And you
Okay.
got the rest of the sentence out there, you got
Yeah.
to fix too. But I think you can just start a new sentence.
Upstream of the bike path. Right? The task force recommended installing riprap to eliminate erosion pending review and approval by
The town
the civil engineer.
Town's contract, read as the contract.
By the town's contract engineer.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then I agree with Phil, we should start a new sentence and just say, the task force recommends a
This-
solution to minimize the removal of trees.
No.
Or,
No.
no?
No, they're not recommending removal of trees.
No,
No,
they're
this solution
recommending
will
this
minimize-
solution to minimize the
Okay.
removal of
Okay.
trees. Yeah, definitely recommending the solution to minimize the removal of trees.
And they wanted a less invasive
Right.
procedure.
So the task force recommends this solution to minimize the removal of trees.
Other than that, the meeting notes, meeting minutes are fine.
I have no other changes even.
Okay, anybody else have any changes? If not, we can approve these minutes with those two sentences.
I was to approve.
I'll second
Everybody
it.
okay with that? It's unanimous?
No,
It's unanimous, okay. All right, thank you. Presentations by residents. Are there any presentations by residents tonight? Oh, that's a resounding silent echo. Okay. There are no presentations. Okay, on to action items. We do not have anything listed for action tonight, unless, again, council sees something, but we'd have to adjust the agenda, so we will give you a second. The second has passed. So there are no actions. Okay. New business.
So Strathmore Sidewalk Field Walk with State Highway Administration, as well as the District 18 legislators and residents of the surrounding communities. I thought it was well attended. It occurred on December 3rd at 10 o'clock in the morning. We went for the full 2 hours that were slotted. We had delegates Jared Solomon, Al Carr, and a staff representing Emily Shetty, and a staff representing Senator Jeff Wallstreicher. We had about, I think I counted 17 or 19 people in attendance. Make that 21. And we had, from the town of Garrett Park, we had Councilman Hans Wegner, myself, we had Dick Pratt and George Miller. We had representatives from the Holy Cross Parish and Church
And school.
and school. Thank you. And we had probably at least 7, give or take, staff from the State Highway Administration District 3. We first had a discussion indoors, because it was very cold and was appreciated. That gave us sort of the lay of the land by State Highway. And then we proceeded to walk the length of the section of sidewalk from where the sidewalk in Garrett Park ends at its most west terminal along Strathmore. And we walked from there all the way up to basically the Holy Cross Academy entrance, discussing variations or discussing various concerns, mostly dealing with how much room should be allowed between the edge of a sidewalk, a new sidewalk, and the curb and gutter of the existing road. There was also concern about the stormwater flow, and it was pretty much a unanimous request by the communities in attendance that we maximize the space that we can get, the green space between the edge of the sidewalk and the curb. The original design called for the sidewalk to be abutting against the curb and gutter. Another thing we learned is that this is being funded by SHA's, I think it's called Fund 29, no, not Fund 20, Fund 79. New sidewalk construction for pedestrian access. It's called Fund 79. Without getting into some of the minutia, bureaucratic minutia, it calls on the state providing 70% of the cost and 25% by the local jurisdictions. I have to say, you know, the county, the town, we don't really have the sidewalk, this new sidewalk within our jurisdiction. While it would abut the Holy Cross School and Church, that's really the Archdiocese property. While it would abut the property of St. Angela Hall, that property is not owned by our Archdiocese. It's owned by the Sisters of the Holy Cross in the state of Indiana. So there are some things that would definitely have to be coordinated. There is a requirement that the local jurisdictions would take responsibility for the maintenance of the sidewalks and, you know, future, you know, the snow shoveling and so forth. I heard a comment by one of the District 3 engineers that said, you know, there's like a 1 year, or there's a one-time fix by the state if a sidewalk cracks or something, but after that, that they would fix, but after that, if anything else happens, it's on local jurisdictions to fix that. Hans, would you like to add anything? I think that might cover my notes.
I think the shared costs would be for planning and staging and all that, but the actual construction and building of the sidewalk would be in SHA's fund.
No, that's actually the other way around.
Is it the
So,
other way around?
so
Okay.
design, conceptual
Doesn't
and
do
final
that.
designs are all paid by the state, 100%.
Right. And then,
The construction is the split share of the 75 for state, 25 by
by the
jurisdictions.
adjoining property owners.
But,
Yeah,
as we heard,
yeah.
the county has a vested interest in this, and according to Delegate Solomon, he believes the county may pick this up, may pick up this 25%, but, you know, that's yet to be seen.
If we work with our delegate, with our county council members and get them to, on our side, yeah.
Right,
Which he volunteered to do.
yeah. There are a few other kind of bureaucratic things that'll have to go in play, but what the current timeline is for this is the designs hopefully would be completed by the final, by next summer of 2020. There's some letters and some MOUs that have to be done to, you know, state the local jurisdiction's responsibility to maintain the sidewalks, so all that has to get done up front, as well as the potential of gaining extra right-of-way through possible procurement or buying of land if the current right-of-way is not sufficient to maintain this, to gain this green space gap as well as the stormwater management. And that's why I laid out the principles involved who actually own the properties, because that's a different level of coordination and negotiation. It's quite possible that the sale of some land to the state, because the state cannot just have an easement, they have to own the land, maybe could offset some of that 25% share. Anyway, back to the timeline. Conceptual to final design, summer of 2020. More community involvement, and then potential start of construction in 2021. Does that sound about right, Hans?
Yep. And as to the question of community input into whatever design they come up with, you know, obviously that will impact the planning stage and how much time it takes to get from point A to point where we need to be.
And we all know what that's like.
Yep.
Okay, so that was the only new business I really had. If there are no other discussions by council members or questions.
I was just wondering, who is the principal proponent for this? Is it the state?
Well, I think the biggest sponsors are the District 18 officials. So you'll have state, but if we can get the county, and I understand,
I think the people pushing for it are the Holy Cross and the Holy Cross properties or related.
and Garrett Park
to
So it's a
some
coalition.
extent.
Estates, not
And
necessarily
then,
us.
you
Yeah.
know, theoretically also, it serves, Symphony Woods has their own sidewalk, and would be,
Yeah.
but the argument is that you could walk more easily to the metro if we then draw metro in, or if Montgomery County draws metro in and says, can we have a walking path along a sidewalk down Strathmore, and at some point cut over onto a new walking path that might be built to the metro.
Sure.
Some-
I guess
To
what I
make-
really meant was,
Mhm.
is there a particular organization taking the lead? That
I'm
sound
not
like-
aware of one.
We made the initial request and push. But I really think it, you know, I've heard different conversations and remarks, but I really believe it should be the jurisdictions that would have the sidewalks in front of
May share
them.
in the cost.
Yeah, because we're not planning to provide any
Right.
cost incentive here.
It'd be great if the county.
So
Yeah.
you may remember there was a petition or survey,
Right.
you know, from all around. And I'm not aware that we got anybody from the Symphony Park, but we did get people from Garrett Park Estates and White Flint Park. So they might have some vested interest as well. And what I'm told is it's not really just those entities that would abut directly against the new sidewalk, but it's interested. And that was underscored, but I still will say that I don't think the town should be providing any cost. So we'll see.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, let's go on to town updates. SRTS project. Well, I am hoping we will have a conference call tomorrow with the principals of, you know, the contracts that we have with Patriot and Save a Tree, who's a sub to Patriot, as well as R&S Concrete, who is also a sub to Patriot, as well as Hyatt Brown, and most likely some of the District 3 engineers. I can tell you right now, we are still waiting on what's called submittals. These are documents and checklists that are required under this grant program by the state highway. I've also learned that it's not necessarily for approval, because it is our contract and we're the sponsor of the contract, but it is for audit purposes. So we still need to be able to send them. And of course, if they look at them and they'll say, oh, something's wrong, which is what we found out with the project schedule. The project schedule, as some of you might have remembered, had shown 238 days.
In the bid.
They were, well, the
By the
IFB,
bidder.
right, the IFB called for 150 calendar days. The Patriot number of 238 was based on working days. And whether, you know, and then we found that there was a mistake or two in their Microsoft project, if you all know what that is. So they had some days in there that weren't supposed to have been counted, and it was restricting other parts of the calculations of the days that would follow for milestones that would be completed. Once they got that figured out, the latest revision shows 155 days. Well, doesn't that sound great? But the unfortunate thing is, it is still working days, and our IFB called for calendar days. So that 155 working days still would put it ending about 7 months. 150 days should be ending in 5 months, no more. So we will we will be doing a change order. Patriot will have to make a formal request for a time extension. We will be approving that, sending that forward to District 3 engineers. Still in question about whether they actually have to approve it. We'll find that out maybe tomorrow. Their approval process will take another 3 months, but we've been assured that we can still continue to work the construction while that change order is making its way through, if that's the way it goes. And that's because up until the moment they hit, you know, what would be 150 calendar days, they can be working. You know, so, you know, ostensibly, they could actually submit a change order for a time request, you know, right near the end of that 150 90-day calendar window, but we already know that the process will take too long. So we're going to end up starting that much sooner so that we aren't going to be in, a wait-and-see mode. I think,
And what is it, who will make the determination to start the project on a given day? Is that SHA?
We will. we will,
Okay,
as long as we are getting our compliance documents in, but they are in for audit purposes. The schedule.
And does Patriot make the request to change the number of days? Do they make that to SHA, or do
No,
they
they make it
us?
to us, because
Okay.
we are the owner and
Okay.
the sponsor.
Okay.
We're the owner of the contract, and we're the
if we-
sponsor of the
And if we say
project.
not acceptable, what happens? If we say, we specified that this project be done in
Yeah.
150 days, and here you come
Yeah.
after the bids to say, well, actually,
Yeah.
it's going to be, 30% more. At what
So-
point?
So the unfortunate thing is that this has moved from a summer project into a winter project.
Yeah.
So they have anticipated, weather delays, and there are a few more holiday breaks in there, which also adds on. But according to Patriot, they would never have been able to get it done in 150 calendar days. That's what I was told. So one of the leverages that we have is in the IFB, we explicitly state liquidation of damages of $250 per day for every day after the contract period ends if the project isn't done. So we know, and we've already stated that to them to remind them of that. So if we're extending a time request, a time extension, we stipulated it would be only done if it's a no-cost time extension. And if there was a little pushback, it was a reminder to them that, hey, this is what the IFB actually called for, 150 calendar days, and anything after that would be a charge of $250 a day. So they obviously don't want to get stuck in that. So I think we're going to be okay. We'll find out again more tomorrow. As you know, we had a sample concrete pour a few weeks ago in the Garrett Park swimming pool parking lot. The color that had been prescribed in the plan, specs, and estimate document for the IFB, for the invitation for bid, was taupe, although it was still at the town's discretion. Well, we went ahead with the taupe. That was what was in there before I became mayor. Since the pour of that color, I think everybody I've heard from can't stand the color, and it looks pink. If anybody has seen it, I don't know if anybody else got a chance to see it, but it's pretty darn pink. So, taupe is like a putty, color. It can have a little bit more brown, it can have a little pink, it's like putty. It sort of depends, Well, this instance, it's more like a pink. So we are allowed to pick another color, but we cannot have a sample pour of it because it would incur a lot of cost of about $2,500, which we think is unnecessary. And I talked with Hans about this and with George Miller. We also found that, we could make that determination by, seeing the concrete colors that's poured in the field as it happens. But we had to give them something. So we gave them, with Hans's input and George's input, a spectrum of grays, and we were leaning towards dark grays. And the R&S Concrete Company came back and said, no, all of those are special colors and would be much more costly. So the only standard colors that we got were two, one which I think is too light, and the other one is, and the one that's too light has a little brown in it, but I've been advised to stay away from the browns because browns, as you know, usually has the color red in there somehow. And I don't want to make another mistake of getting something that looks more red. So we've all leaned towards, and, I did ask some input. Hans hasn't had a chance to look at this yet, but some of the other folks have. And we got the color Midnight Bay. It looks kind of slate-like color. When it gets wet, it really does look dark. It's nice, but it kind of matches more, in my mind, slate or rock color. Of course, whatever rock color can be, you can have all kinds of color rocks, but anyway, some of the sidewalks around town have a lot of that reddish, actually, they look more brownish, but I don't want to take the chance of that, of getting a reddish color.
Most of the brown that you see is from the stain of the leaves
That's-
on top of the bare concrete. and
That's what I
it's
thought,
gonna turn brown.
and possible dirt and,
It's like a
stuff
tea
that
bag
goes.
or something
Yeah,
else that will stain.
right, right.
But that color gray is kind of similar with the original idea for making a tinted sidewalk came up with the Historic Preservation's walk of the sidewalks lots or the sidewalk locations we were standing just at the corner down here. That was sort of the idea we had in mind originally when we pitched the idea of doing the colored sidewalk, is it might be like an asphalt sidewalk kind of blends in, where the concrete sidewalk, the stark white sidewalks on Strathmore
Yeah.
don't really blend in.
Right.
So
Right.
this seems in line with what that community
Matches your
really
shirt,
thought.
Steve.
Sorry?
Matches your shirt.
Yeah, that's why I wore it.
Oh
I
my
had a
God, I
sweater on
can't see,
before.
I can't
Oh,
tell the
yes.
difference.
I took my taupe off before I got here.
Anyway, this is, right now what we're going with. We had to send something in because,
I'd be comfortable with that.
okay.
Prefer darker, but
Thank you,
I'd
Hans.
start
It's-
somewhere.
It's not quite as, you can see how much lighter it looks against Andrea's sweater, and we were leaning towards that kind of color dark, so, but this is really the best we can do without incurring additional cost.
That looks like kind of aged asphalt anyway.
Yeah, that-
With sun bleach
that's
to
kinda
that
what
kind
I'm
of color, I
told,
think it looks
yeah.
good.
Yeah, I
Good.
like that. And it will be abutting some driveways and the
That's
state,
true.
the Strathmore sidewalk, right?
Right.
So it will, where it's lighter,
Yeah.
so we wouldn't want it too much of a
Yeah.
contrast.
True. True. One more thing, the reason I cannot give you a notice of when we're actually supposed to start this contract construction work, is because we are waiting, as I mentioned early at the beginning of this, we're waiting on submittals. Submittals include material lists, and those are furnished by the subcontractors. And, this is tracked down to the unit of cost. So I've been told every week we were going to get them, but I was told again we'd probably have them by the end of the day today, and I haven't seen anything. The revised schedule, for what it's worth, is now showing notification to residents and possible mobilization, which just might mean getting some of the contractors on site as early as the 16th of December. But I wouldn't quote me. And so I just don't know. Maybe we'll have something more confirming tomorrow. I think that's all I have. If there's any other questions?
Thank you.
Who would have known? Okay, shall we go to Councilmember Stephen Piskowski on the land use and historic
Can I-
preservation?
Can I suggest that I follow, because my subject is very close to what you just talked about, because it was the same meeting. Essentially, on the question of having,
Should have changed that on the agenda.
I'm
Okay,
sorry.
that's right. Go ahead, Hans.
If
What are we talking about, Hans?
we're talking about a traffic signal on Knowles Hill
Okay.
that it mimics what happens at Keswick when a pedestrian asks for a flashing yellow light. The same flashing light signal would send a signal to a flashing light on the hill saying pedestrian in crosswalk careful, or something to that effect. So and it would only blink when there's demand by a pedestrian to activate that blinking sign. So it wouldn't be something you see every day, 24 hours a day. It would work only during the effective time. It would be more effective at catching drivers' attention for the short sight line and the need to be able to stop quickly should they encounter somebody in the traffic game. I've been working so far with SHA, and essentially they said, yes, we agree, but we don't think it merits, in this case, it merits the expense. So I went to Jeff Waldstresser's office, have been working with him and copying him on the correspondence that I've had with SHA on this, and they support what we want to do. In talking to them, after I heard from SHA that they would not fund this thing, I said, what's the approach we should take? And they said, let's make sure that all of our delegates agree to this as a logical solution. So I took this opportunity when we had the delegates here to specifically talk to Al Carr and to Jared Solomon, and they both are very supportive of this. They know they know the street, they know the difficulty, they understand what we want for, and they said this is a marginal cost issue. Why don't we just do it? Since Emily Shetty was not at the meeting here, I talked to her designated representative from her office, and he's very supportive. So the next logical step is to find out what they as a delegation want to do to support us. Do they go directly to SHA and say we would like to have this done, or do they want some other way of approaching this without offending SHA and the judgment they made? So I'm waiting to hear back from them. That's where that stands. So that's why
Great,
it follows
Hans.
logically to the discussion on the sidewalk on Strathmore.
Okay, great. Did you want to say anything else about stormwater or anything while you have the opportunity?
Yeah,
Okay,
as
I
far
think
as
we
know,
talked about it.
you know,
Okay.
we haven't had any discussions
Okay.
with Jason to find out
We haven't gotten the,
what's the next step.
we haven't gotten the report from Chuck Berry
Right.
yet.
So,
Okay. Let's go now to Councilmember Stephen
Sure.
Poskowski. I'm sure.
Okay.
Everybody else is sure.
This is sort of a blend of a topic, both land use and historic preservation. The whole reason, well, not the whole reason, but the main reason we have a lot of our own land use regulations are because of the historic nature of the town and the historic setting. So we're always looking to preserve those. Land Use Advisory Committee has been great to work with, and we've been talking about several issues over the last year and a half, and one of them we've been talking about is corner setbacks, and we recently got together and had a meeting to kind of talk about this in a little bit more in detail. And in general, when we look at these things, we're looking through the lens of whether they really, everything about whether it promotes and guardrails the overarching Garrett Park goals of the lot coverage. It's less than what you would normally have in an R90 zone. It's 20% instead of 30% in the historic landscape and that historic setting, and also the spirit of the original town plan. Things have changed a little bit over time, but I'm trying to think a little bit, and this one's near and dear to me, of, you know, what was really the intent of the people to put the town plan together back in the 1890s. That's, you know, I mean, even if it is a little bit different than now, how can we accommodate both ways of doing things? So corner lots really vary by size and shape. Some of them are more square, became more squarish over time, but we still have a lot that are more, they're narrow and they're long. They might be like 50, 60 feet wide, and they're 200 feet deep, which is very common in the middle of the block. It's not as common on the corners now, but things change a lot with the way our setbacks work. If you're in the middle of a block and you're a 50-foot wide lot, you have two 10-foot slivers of side setback that you can't really build upon. Then you have 30 feet that's left over in the middle, and you could build a 30-foot house that is whatever the depth is that you can get up to your max lot coverage if you so desire. But if you're on a corner lot, you have that 30-foot front setback on that front street, you have another 30-foot setback on your side street, and then you still have that 10-foot side setback on the other side. So in theory, you could take the second lot from the corner, which is where I live on mine. If I move my lot to the corner, then all of a sudden, instead of having a 30-foot wide spot you can build, it's 10 feet wide. So that's the thing we've been looking at is, does that really make sense, and you know, how can we address that? We looked at it a lot of different ways. George Martin, not the elder, the younger, did a really fantastic diagram of all this. He had like 10 different colors with, you know, every different corner lot configuration you could possibly get in town. So it was very interesting to kind of see. We talked about a couple of different ways to address this, and some of them were sliding scales and other ways that maybe could get too complicated. It would take too many words to kind of address it, but what we thought maybe makes the most sense is to try to find a way to recognize what the county does with things that are in the base R90 zoning. They'll have a front street and a side street, but there's definitions about how you might get a side street. It's not every street. So if you have, say, a street like what Phil's house is, it's the last on that street, and there's a park next to it, so he doesn't really have like a side neighbor. If there was a corner there, there would be a different condition. And there are other houses like that are in town where there's houses along one street and it turns the corner and all of a sudden there's a park on the end, or there's the end of a block and there's no other house. Or you have others where it's two lots that originally would have been, they would have been back to back. Like if you had the narrow end at the front end of like the 50-foot, 60-foot wide would have been the front, and then the long side would have been the side street. The two of them have backyards that touch, but they don't have other lots in between. So there's various ways of, that county side street definition that we're feeling that we could find a way to amend the zoning to allow that, allow that to be taken care of, or allow that sort of a side street setback to be considered. So the idea is I'm gonna write all this up in an article, put it in the Bugles, just so we get a little bit more general awareness of what this is about. And the idea is to try to put together proposed language that we can introduce at the January council meeting and potentially approve at the February meeting. So I welcome any feedback or thoughts that folks around town have on that kind of an issue between now and then.
Great. Stephen, can I ask a question? Does this also impact the potential of the ADUs, the alternative dwelling units, and whether they can even be built? I mean, that's part of
It
my
could,
concern.
yeah, and that's the thing, I don't think the county has really even totally addressed that yet in there. And they do have language on their books, and they have diagrams from, I think it was 2013 when I looked at it, that shows how they could work, but that was for garages. They didn't really have it addressed as far as like a living unit, so, interesting question we'll have to tackle with that too.
Okay.
We talked, at that last meeting we had, it was just before Thanksgiving, that
Yeah.
committee, we talked about the ADUs as well, so.
Okay.
And our thinking on that generally is to treat the ADUs as though they are a garage, that they're not really any different, that, whatever the side and rear setbacks that would be required for a garage or a shed or things like that could be used for that.
I can understand with the setbacks, although it has its own issues with, utility, usage, parking, and all that, right? So
Yeah.
it
gets-
starts to impact other areas of our code and the
gets-
policies that we have.
Yeah, it just gets trickier when you get on
Yeah.
a corner lot, because then all of a sudden you could have one house that faces, say, the narrow end of a corner lot, then you turn the corner and all of a sudden there's a small house, an accessory house that's in the back that faces the other street. You would have house, accessory side of a house that faces the other street, so, not,
Would it be possible for us to get a copy of the drawings that George did? George Martin?
yeah, I think so, and I have some that I did on the accessory dwelling units, so I could try to put them in, either put them on the website or maybe just try to get some of the most pertinent parts of it in the Bugle article, because I think I can put some small images in there to get a little bit more awareness of it.
So I was just sharing a question here with Andrea. So as far as we know, I mean, the county's moving kind of fast on these ADUs.
It goes into effect
And
on
they
the
passed it,
31st, I
right?
believe.
Right, so, thanks. And we would fall into that unless we come up with our own exemption.
Mhm.
So that's why I've asked about, it's not just about a building, it's about that kind of building and what else it impacts.
Well, we
And I'm not
can-
making an
we can-
opinion on this at all, I'm
well,
just bringing it up.
Our zoning powers are, we can have things that are more restrictive than
Yes,
the
we
base
can have
zoning
more
or like
restrictive.
our overlay. So we have the base zoning of R90 and then our Garrett Park overlay, which is attached to the county zoning as the second layer. And our ordinance is the third layer. We can do things that are less restrictive. We can't,
More
more
restrictive.
restrictive. We can't do things that
Yeah.
are less restrictive.
Right,
And we also,
Right.
we're not allowed to regulate on what the use is. So we can deal with how things are positioned and what the lot coverage is, so like our lot coverage is 20% maximum, whereas our 90 base is 30% maximum, so if you go to White Flint Park, the houses could be as much as 30%, ours can be 20%, so we can do it that way, but we can't say that you can't have a house there, or you can't have an accessory dwelling, or you can't have a garage, those kinds of things.
And yet
So-
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was just thinking, I mean, we are exempt, for example, from residents. We don't have anything that is in our code that allows residents, for example, to rent out through Airbnbs, for example, even though that is allowed by county. But you're saying that we would not be able to define the use of this ADU, so you're saying it's sort of out of our power or
That's my
code
understanding is we don't
to
have,
control that? It's just how much space we would allow?
yeah, that's how
Wow,
we would control it, but
interesting. Okay,
it's not, that's my understanding, is it's
Yeah.
not part of
it's okay, yeah,
our zoning power, our
Mhm.
land use power.
okay.
And ADU could also be combined with or part of the house itself, right?
Yes, so it could be attached in the back or even the
Right.
side. I'm not sure where they landed on it, but they debated it a while at the county level, whether or not the two front doors could both face the same way, or if you had to have it at the side or the back. You can also, there's less limits if you put, I think it's 1,200 square foot maximum, I believe, or 50% of your main dwelling, whichever is less. And that restriction is taken away if you're building it in the basement. So if you have a massive one-story house and wanted to build a 2,000 square foot ADU, that's not barred. So it's interesting, a lot of the talk about them, that was a point that was brought up a lot. And another one is and I haven't checked this out myself to know for sure if this is true, but it sounds like there's a restriction on having a guest house on your property. But then all of a sudden now you can have an accessory dwelling unit, but I don't know how they would enforce that you wouldn't be using it as a guest house, like if you want to just have it when family or friends come to visit.
And yet
if there's
we
gonna
would
be a-
not allow it, at least as far as our code goes, we wouldn't allow it to be used for Airbnb rental.
No.
Because we don't allow that.
No, yeah. So
We
the-
have to opt in other words, for that county rule on that Airbnb.
Yeah,
Oh, that's interesting.
But it could be declared an ADU,
Which,
in which case maybe,
yeah. Well, there was talk about that too with ADUs. There were a lot of jurisdictions were worried about them being used for Airbnb specifically, so that was put in the language. It has to be a certain length of rent, so I just don't know how they're gonna enforce it.
Okay.
Other jurisdictions have brought this up, like, if you can't have a guest house and you can't have it be an Airbnb, who's gonna regulate that? Who's gonna control that? I don't, maybe that's been figured out in the meantime, but I haven't seen anything about it, like who controls it. Maybe there'll be a rent police around to make sure that, everybody is renting to someone and someone's paying that rent and it's more than 90 days or whatever the Airbnb max is, so.
So Stephen, is the committee leaning towards taking a position on whether Garrett Park should amend its ordinances for the zoning related to the ADUs?
We were looking at it, it seemed like we could, the existing regulations we have as far as the side and the rear setbacks, they kind of would cover ADU. We need to talk about it a little bit further, because some of the issues I brought up and showed on some sketches are, there's nothing really, unless it's been developed again further by the county. So if they already have something in there, we already get whatever their minimum regulation is, plus whatever we put on top of it. But if they don't put something in, some of the situations are, you could have, like I was discovering earlier, a house with a backyard and an ADU that faces the street next to another house that faces the street. Or you could have, say it was a mid-block house, you could have a house that's regularly positioned relative to others in town, and all of a sudden you've got an ADU that's not held in the back for privacy of that dwelling unit itself, but it's pushed up maybe 5 feet away from the back of the house, and you have just a little gap that could look awkward. It's attached almost, but not quite. So we were talking about that a little bit. If the county doesn't cover, say, those kind of things, we may want to get in there and put in some things to say that there's an X amount of space in the main dwelling. Or,
Okay.
or maybe a maximum from the backyard.
We look forward to all this work that you guys are doing, you and your task force.
Yeah, and so again, the idea is to formulate these these recommended changes and put them out for introduction in January and approval in February.
Okay.
So would that be for both the corner setbacks and the ADUs, or just the corner setbacks?
Probably just the corner setbacks for now. We're still studying the ADUs.
Okay.
So you'd only, so you'd have theoretically one or two public sessions on it then, one during the introduction and one during the approval?
Exactly.
I-
And now, and the people
My-
are goal is.
My inclination is to say, you need a lot more time. You need to have a lot more public feedback to get a sense of the town and make sure that we understand what the concerns of the community are, and not just what's technically possible.
For the,
If it-
for the
the last
setbacks
time-
for the
For
corner
the
lots?
setbacks.
Whatever,
not
too many.
whatever we do that changes the existing zoning needs to be thoroughly discussed and needs to be out in the open, and we need to have public meetings to make sure we can hear what people say about them, and to what extent there's support and to what extent there is not. And to think about problems that we hadn't anticipated.
That's sort of the idea, that's the idea of putting something out in the Bugle, just
Yeah.
to get a little bit more
Yeah.
awareness of it, so when it's
That's a good
introduced-
place to start, but I
When
don't
it's
think
introduced.
I don't think it'll be as simple as a budget amendment, where as long as the five of us agree, we can support it. This is much broader. Now it involves everybody in town.
I would agree. That's where I was kind of going with that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's especially tricky, because I think there's a lot of emotion behind the topic, but I think a lot of times there's more emotion than there is
It's property
understanding of it,
rights.
so-
It's simple as, it's property
More
rights.
emotion than understanding is a
Yeah.
very insightful remark.
So,
Mhm.
and that's what we're trying to be aware of, that issue, to help the folks that perhaps have more emotion than understanding of it, so.
Okay, Stephen, well, a lot of work ahead, I appreciate it.
Okay.
Wow. Okay, we have archives and traffic and parking. Councilman Schultz?
Okay, well, traffic and parking, we've already had requests for somebody to issue some warnings. There's somebody who noted that people have started parking in the no parking zones, and the thought is that things are only going to get worse during the holiday season, when more people are coming to Black Market to have something to eat. So I've got to get together something to put out for a warning list, warning sign, flyer, if you will, because that'll be the first phase of things, is just to put out a warning to say that, you know, we're beginning to enforce, unlike in the past when we did not.
This
So,
is down by the park, or?
yeah, down by the park, yeah.
Well, and wherever we find them,
But,
actually.
yeah, wherever we find them, I
Wherever
mean,
the
but,
restricted parking signs are, right?
right, that's,
Pool, the swimming pool.
that was the big one right now. And switching to archives, why, the Archives Committee met last Thursday and elected Karen Teal as committee chair and Malcolm Russell Einhorn, who we talked about earlier, as vice chair. And they've had a good discussion about current and future activities, and their next meeting will be in February.
Great. Are there any other discussions on this or anything else? Oh, yes, sir. I'm sorry. Yeah, you want to use that? Name and street.
Keith Cosby in Montrose. I was wondering if we have a history on the side street setbacks, because there are houses in town that are built outside of the current setbacks. So the ordinances and the setbacks that are currently in place were put in place at some point after those houses were built.
They were grandfathered in. They were grandfathered in,
Well, but they were built beforehand,
yeah.
so they're
So they're-
grandfathered in with the new ordinance. But before then, they were built before any ordinance
I
was
see
in
what
place, right?
The existing house is grandfathered in, but
Right,
if the house is replaced, then it would have to follow the new
Right,
regulation.
exactly, but the ordinance went in place after those houses were built.
And your
Right.
question is, what precipitated that?
Yes. Because if it's historic preservation, then the houses that were existing before that ordinance was built, doesn't that say that the historic preservation changed and subsequently changed the setbacks to a more restrictive state?
Well, I think we look through the land use now, or more modern times, with that lens of trying to preserve what the historic character of the town was. It's not as though that lens per se would have changed. I mean, a lot of houses were built in this town in the 40s and 50s, different than they were in the 1890s and 1900s. And the zoning had changed. There wasn't really any zoning back in there was no zoning until the 20s. That's when it started. There was no zoning nationwide until the 20s. And in the East Coast here, it started growing more and more. And eventually, my understanding is this town at one point had R60 zoning and maybe something else even before R90 which is what we have now as our base, was put in for here. And places like Whitefield Park, and if you go to Olney, a lot of that is R90 as well, some sections of Rockville, where it's generally larger lots than a little bit closer to the city, which may have R60, so it's a little bit less percentage on larger lots and wider setbacks, so on and so forth. So that kind of has all changed over the years, and when R90 was settled in this town, Garrett Park also had the ability, we had the ability granted to be able to put more restrictions on top of that, and that's when those, I think it was 15 years or so ago that a lot of that was put together, maybe less. That changed that, so there was the lot coverage was, I think the lot of debate was landed on it being 20% of your lot versus the 30%.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Right.
So it's just all the existing houses that may fall outside of those lines. We have some that fall like in front of the front setback. We have a lot that fall outside the side setback. We have some that are way closer to the side setbacks than what we have now.
Right.
Some that are over the lot coverage area of what we have now. But anything that's really built new and or replaced or added onto it needs to fall into that new envelope. So that's what we're just looking at to see if there's, maybe there's something that with those corner lots that could be a little bit more relief on lots that maybe were not really planned to be built in that mid-50s kind of a way. They were still kind of set up with that late 1800s sort of a proportion, so if that makes sense.
So to answer your question?
Yes, it was vague and it became more restrictive over time. And so houses that were existing.
And there was a really thorough process which involved the whole town of a committee that worked for at least 2 years and maybe 3, included at least 20 members of the community, where this whole discussion of how do we use space and what should we as a community have and what should we not have, what can we do to be more in compliance with what the county regulations are, and where do we want to deviate from the county regulations in order to preserve open space. So it was open space as a big question. It was some historic preservation, although I don't think historic preservation was the driving force. And then it was the character of the neighborhood with flowing streets and yards that vary, all of which were weighed by this committee. And what was produced was a set of guidelines that we have now, which we now say maybe we don't make it, if we stick to what we have, we won't necessarily be able to accommodate the requirements of the county to accommodate smaller developments to increase density in a given development.
Say that again?
Well, the additional housing units.
Oh,
ADUs.
the
Alternate housing
alternative
units.
dwelling units?
Yeah.
One key thing about that,
Because it now creates a second demand for a piece of, for use of land on a piece of property exceeding that of the family that lives there today.
Okay, that's a separate issue from side street setback.
I understand that, but setbacks affects that. How much, what can we do within the setback And if we can't, if it limits us too much, I think what Stephen is saying is that where can we look at the limitations that the setbacks place on property owners, and are those still valid?
Yeah, I think the overall, and correct me if I'm wrong, Stephen, but I think, when this was all discussed, as Hans described, like 15 years ago, and I remember sitting in those council meetings, part of the objective was to kind of restrict overbuilding on the lots. And what's been going on for, right, decades of the mansionization and all that stuff. So I think this was part of the attempt, because it also restricted height as well. It wasn't just the footprint, but the up. Yeah, so.
And even just your FAR, so your floor area ratio, we have a floor area ratio in town here, but the county doesn't for other residences. So you could build, as long as you're within the setbacks and the max height, you can build a pretty big bulky house on, say, an R60 lot.
Right, but for some of the side street dwellings, with the current setbacks, that's an unreasonable 15-foot wide house. And that's a shed, basically, so.
Yeah, that's what we're trying to find a way to, make that, keep it reasonable, and but also keep with the spirit of all the other regulations that were put together. And you really see the effect of it if you look at an aerial map of this area, and if you look at other areas that are surrounding it. If you look at Garrett Park, it looks like you're in the middle of a park.
Yeah, and that's
just because there's so much tree coverage, because there's the houses are relatively small size compared to the overall amount of land. So that's something that's paramount to preserve, is that setting. So, and I should have mentioned that earlier. Hans was bringing it up as far as the ADUs, but that was part of our thinking with, there was so much blood, sweat, and tears put into that 20% long ago. So we're feeling like that's just not a book anybody wants to reopen. So as far as an accessory dwelling unit, Land Use Advisory Committee, in our early discussion of it, we were thinking just maintain that 20%. So if you have 20% and you want to do 15% of your lot with the main dwelling and 5% with an accessory dwelling, then that could work, but not.
But if you're already
open it
maxed
up
at
to-
20%, you may not be able to
then
put it in.
You just don't build it, so, that was our thinking, so. We welcome, on that issue too, welcome any kind of thoughts folks around town have on that.
So that in a way kind of mimics what you said about the garage. I mean, it's almost like if you don't have room to build a garage, you can't build an ADU.
Yeah, right.
So, and the ADUs they're almost, their setbacks are done almost like a garage, and it's set where say your house is 1,000 square feet, you could build up to 500 square feet of an ADU, but you can't build 1,000 and 1,000 even if your lot would allow it. So.
Dietz, I'm curious, as a neighbor with a corner lot, how long do you think is reasonable for the council if we were to have an introduction of a proposed ordinance change, say in January? How much time should we wait before bringing it forward for approval? 2 months? Because I think we already agreed 1 month is probably not enough time, but is 2 months enough time for
2 months.
community consideration? For community consideration, is 2 months enough time as a resident, in your view?
Honestly,
I'm just asking your opinion.
Dweller, so.
That's true. You would be for.
So am I. So are we.
So, but, my house was built 15 feet from the setback, from the right of way, basically, of the town property. So I see, an additional 15 feet as kind of unreasonable, because my house is built, and if I wanted to put an addition, I'd have to file a variance for basically 40 square feet. So that doesn't really make sense to me. So, honestly, I think the faster the better, but I think two months is a reasonable amount of time.
Thank you.
So do you want us to write in the minutes, Stephen, that you're still thinking of a February approval, or we'll just maybe be looking for an intro
I think you have to
in
let the
January?
process.
Excuse
the
me.
process-
If we would just say that you're looking to make the intro in January and then have subsequent community input, and we won't put down a firm. I'm just want to make sure we don't raise expectations in the minutes, so you could just say with community involvement to follow before it's approved.
Yeah, expecting community involvement at the January introduction. I feel like that could be one and the same thing. You
It
introduce
could.
it and have that
Okay,
involvement, and
that-
there's a month to decide it. That's the
Oh,
whole
it's-
reason for having
Okay, so you,
introduced and approved.
so you want to just keep it within the month as opposed to a couple months? I'm sorry, I was just following the conversation, so.
I think you don't have to say when it's gonna be potentially approved. You could just say that it's gonna be, the
Oh,
idea that would
That's
be,
fine, okay,
introduced and discussed at the January meeting.
okay. We will strike anything from the minutes that say February approval.
Well, I can't predict whether it would be approved or
Okay.
not, so.
Well,
Well,
let's
we
not
could
set the,
propose it.
let's not set the expectation that we will look to approve it in February.
Well,
We'll just have a,
I definitely
yeah.
appreciate and realize that, this requires some community input, but I just don't feel it's necessary to, like, overdo it. I mean, it's not a super complex issue. I feel like it's something that could be discussed at one meeting and have something introduced and then,
See how it goes.
see how it goes from there.
It's really going to be the people on the corner lots. They better show up.
I feel like if we were throwing out the whole, and it's not like we would even consider it, it's not like we're rewriting the entire
No,
language thing. That would
exactly,
not be
exactly, yeah.
reasonable to discuss in 20
Yeah,
minutes, but I feel like
yeah.
this is not that complex of an issue.
Yeah.
I think the main thing is to get the word out, give people a chance to have their say on whatever side they might have.
I'm sorry, Hans, and you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I just think the process has to take run its course.
Right.
And we shouldn't be setting dates. We should say, we will have this discussion.
Okay,
The
that's what I
community's input is critical to helping us with the guidance, and that we will make, just a decision, if we make a decision, based on what the community's wishes are.
Yeah.
And community input, and just leave it at that without making any kind of commitments. Because the fact is, that, yes, you can say, I'm on a corner lot, and it's only my corner lot, but the fact is that part of the zoning process is that, or the setback process is that the corner houses determine what the average setback for the setback houses should be on that street.
They don't.
Oh, no, they don't. I can tell you that.
That's another thing we've been discussing
No,
too, is
they
whether or not
don't.
that makes sense to just do that, because the county does that. But
Yeah.
Garrett Park strikes out there.
Yeah, no.
3 or 4 ways you can figure out an established building line
Okay.
in the county when you get to Garrett Park.
I thought that there
all
were
the-
several
No.
properties in town where that still applied, especially, I think, on Montrose.
No,
Has to
we
use the
went
average
through
of the
that.
2 houses, that's why we
Yeah.
have the variance next door
Okay.
here,
Okay,
because the average of that house and the house
Yeah.
next door are thrown off a little bit
Yeah.
by this
by
building.
this building, yeah. Well, anyway, I just think it's the kind of thing, that it's the perception that people have of Garrett Park as a place that we should consider, and what needs to be protected and preserved, and what can be changed.
Okay, thank you.
And I would agree. I'm like Hans, have been through at least some of it, and I can tell you that it will bring people out of the woodwork.
That's the idea, put
There is
something in the
no-
view
there is
just
no-
so people know.
Sure.
There is no
what's-
rush.
There shouldn't be a rush. I think we just play it out as it goes. Just
Yeah.
don't put a firm date on it, and we just
Yeah.
work it out, because otherwise people get pretty upset. Even if you consider it technically minor, somebody else would consider it to be a big deal.
Right.
So I just caution you.
It's a tough subject, because I think it's, the people that don't do it for a living, it seems more complicated than it really is.
Okay, so once again, thank you. And now, Andrea, we are on the town manager's report.
The November revenues, operations, and capital budgets are at expected levels. Total revenues and expenses are within projections. There was one building permit that was issued for an open roofless deck at 11121 Rokeby. In terms of town office and maintenance highlights, I won't read verbatim what was in my report, but some highlights. We've been working on some projects related to IT, code enforcement challenges, maintenance of the Arboretum. And just today, we received the reimbursement check from CSX for the damage that was done to a CSX tree that we cleaned up during the July 21st storm. So,
Awesome. How much did we get?
$1,175.
Wow.
And then just a reminder that the District 18 delegation town hall meeting was rescheduled to January 6th. Everyone is invited to attend. The meeting will be held here at Garrett Park Town Hall from 7 to 9 p.m. So January 6th, 7 to 9. And that's it for me. Any questions?
Do you have
Question about
anything?
that, we had, I think, 2 light poles that got knocked down by
Right.
fires.
Yeah,
Status on those.
it's been challenging. The vendor that I'm working with, that we worked with before, has a vendor they have to work with, and that person has been very slow to respond. We finally just got a quote back last week with a cost for the 2 light poles and to retrofit them to LED, and it was significantly higher than I thought it would be, even if you account for 2% inflation per year from what we paid however many years ago. It was much higher. So I wrote him and asked, why is the cost so much higher? And also, does this take into account the paint color that was done at that time? And I haven't heard back from him yet. So we're closer, though. At least we have a quote.
Sorry, what you might want to do is, if he says if it's expensive to retrofit the 2 new poles with LEDs, ask him if we give him a contract to do all of the lights and do all of them LED, can he get a special rate?
So I have a quote for both the high-pressure sodium and the LED, and that cost difference wasn't the main problem. It was the cost of the pole.
Yeah, the retrofit.
Yeah, the cost of the pole.
electric, yeah.
In and of itself. But I did also ask, in parallel, asked our other lighting contractor that helps that when we have any lights that go out on
Right,
Strathmore,
right.
asked that lighting contractor what it would cost to do, just to do that section of Knowles where the first light pole went
Right,
out,
right,
the
right.
6 lights that are right there.
Right, right.
If those are retrofitted to LEDs, what that would cost. And we're still waiting to hear back from
Okay.
them. There were some challenges there in understanding some of the specs with what we have now
Right.
and what we need to put in, and it's challenging because we're not electricians, but they're
Right.
asking us more of those kinds of questions. So it took some
And-
digging around in attic files, but
And one of the things that we have to make sure that we do is as we replace lights, that the color temperature of the lights
Right.
complies with what's in place.
yeah. Yeah, and I know that the folks at Arc Lighting have mentioned that to the maintenance staff
Right,
before,
right.
and that they have a particular, that they're thinking about.
Right.
But that's, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I need to make sure they match with whatever
Right,
the other
right.
guys are putting in.
Well, it could also be a time to, if we're going to
Compare.
retrofit to LED, to
Right,
Yeah.
to compare and maybe change the temperature from that bluish
Right.
to something
Yeah.
a little
Exactly.
different.
Yeah.
yeah.
The other thing was, did we,
And one of the things, Phil, is that, remember when they were installed, the bulbs that were put in were brighter than we wanted
Yep.
because SHA requires a certain number of lumens per square foot on the floor below, on the ground level below. And we actually put lower wattage bulbs in and persuaded them that they would work. So we'd have to make sure that we don't increase the wattage,
Oh,
increase the
yeah.
brightness, so that the people
Yeah,
living next to those houses don't have their bedrooms lit up.
agreed.
so we got a waiver for that somehow, huh?
Well, we put a shield into the light bulb, into
Oh.
the fixture.
Yeah, that's what we have in town.
Actually, it should be remeasure those things to see whether or not they're still too bright and whether or not we can go to something a little bit less. Maybe.
Again, that's something that SHA specifies, and we have to live within their specifications, and what we did last time, we cheated a little bit on the low end, but.
Well, but I'm just thinking more along the lines of having somebody measure to verify,
Oh, periodically,
right? And can we,
yeah.
maybe we are putting out too much, we can go down a little bit, but maybe not. I mean, I know we have to stay within the regulation, I get that.
Yeah.
The other question I had was, is it possible to repair the existing poles?
No. When I sent him pictures, he didn't feel like, the one, definitely not, because it was pulled completely off of the
Right.
pegs. And the other one, I'm using the wrong word here, but one of the pegs was damaged. And so because of that, it sort of didn't feel like it was safe, or like they could sort of stand by it to
Okay,
repair it.
yeah, because one of them,
They're aluminum, cast aluminum, so they're not very strong.
no, yeah, because I saw them both. Yeah, I know one got snapped right off, and it would require weld repair at best to do something with it.
I think you took that one out of the street.
Yes, I did.
One other quick,
see, well, for Kenilworth. Trying to think what you said.
You got the safety issue and.
Yeah, so it's still working through, there's also,
So you might want to tell.
for 11112 Kenilworth, that property is also in pre-foreclosure. And when the foreclosure goes through, it will be with Freddie Mac then at that time. And at that point, it will either go on the market or we'll understand if it's going to be torn down. But we won't really know anything until that time. Could be the other thing that
Who would,
it's condemned.
okay, and so it is currently condemned, and you said it could get torn down, but would that be under the foreclosure process, or after maybe a buyer would try to
I
buy
think that's
the?
something Freddie Mac would determine. We won't-
Really?
We don't,
They could tear it down?
I don't know.
Oh,
So when
okay.
I asked the woman with the property management company, essentially right
Mhm.
now, that's the contractor, when a resident in town asked if it would be torn down, that's what she responded to me, was that the next step is that once foreclosure's finished, it goes to Freddie Mac, and then at that time, it could either be torn down or go on the market. So,
Okay.
Couple
But-
of questions. Is that property within the historic district? It's not, correct?
It's not, we just looked.
And it's not an individual contributing property either?
Is it an individual contributing property?
No, I asked, and
No, I know, I
it's
was
not,
wondering,
right?
It's
Stephen.
not. So
It's
when the
not?
National
Okay,
Historic
wow.
District application was put in, that was listed, it had its own sheet, it was like exhibit number 8 or something like that. And the whole history was written of it, but when the county master plan was made, it includes the contiguous blocks over across the street and 6 other places, including this building, and that's not one of them.
Right, but isn't there also another level of getting to Jerry Lee's question about, is this a contributing model or form of architecture versus a non-contributing versus,
Sadly,
do you remember?
that's the way it
There's
works.
three?
and we
It's
have
either
national-
in the district or it's contributing, right? Those are the two possibilities?
Yeah,
Oh, that would
it's either
keep
in
it,
the
yeah, I see what
district,
you mean,
but
yeah.
for it to require a HAWC,
Right.
so Historic Area Work Department with the county,
Mhm.
it has to be like in that historic district or a contributing property that's individually listed, so like your house is, Jerry Lee's house is one, and this building is one, the house across the street
Gotcha.
is one.
Okay,
And the that it is the Melville house, we're talking about the Hollerith house further down Kenilworth, that's
Mhm.
one of them.
Mhm.
Those are the only ones that are really historically protected. So my
Okay.
understanding of the National Historic District is what really triggers that. If, say, the federal government wanted to build a highway through here, then they would have to say, well, we can't do that because it's a National Historic District through town. But as far as the individual houses, there's not an individual protection for them.
okay.
Let me switch back to the subject we were talking about before with LED lights. A question I would be interested in is finding out what's the cost premium for doing all in LED versus having the existing incandescent lights or whatever they are. Number one, and number two, what the projected savings over the next 10 years is for having LED lights in usage as opposed to conventional lights. I think we as a town ought to be doing all we can to ameliorate the threats of climate change, and I would like to have that information on the basis of which we make a decision.
I would agree, and I would also ask that you look at, because we just, well, I didn't personally, but Amtrak just installed in their shops new LED lighting, but one of the interesting things about that is that they're basically dual brightness, so they would normally sit at a somewhat dimmer brightness, and then as soon as somebody approaches the thing, it goes back on the full brightness, and then after like 10 minutes or something, it drops itself back to dim. So in cases of middle of the night, on a work week or something, we could save some energy by virtue of the fact that most of them would probably be able to stay dim until somebody walked up to the thing, in which case it would
I think the deer will ensure we'll still get a good
maybe. I know a number of towns have done this because I've
Deer
talked
and
to some
foxes.
people. Yeah. Foxes might be too small, but deer, sure.
Would it be acceptable to wait until we get the 6
course.
lights that go in
Of
on
course, of
Strathmore and
course, of
see
course.
what the reaction
Of
is
course,
to that?
of course.
Okay.
Climate change didn't happen yesterday. It's happened over 100 years.
I ask only because I've done LED streetlight retrofits
Yeah,
in 2
right,
other
right, yeah,
cities,
right.
and it's a project.
I know,
It's,
I know,
I know they're
I'm
cheaper
aware.
now, but it's a project to do the cost-benefit analysis
No, I
correctly
understand,
and
I
all
understand,
that, so
I
just want to
understand.
make sure that
I think it's
they-
probably more data out there now than you
Yeah, oh,
had
sure.
before, so
Yeah,
it'd be
yeah.
easier to make the justification.
Mhm.
I just want to know, in the scheme of things, how much money are we talking about? And,
Yeah.
based on that, make a decision on what we should do as a
Yeah.
town.
Yeah, and I think there'll be some things that we learned from the retrofit of the six that we could,
Right.
that would help for that process.
Yeah.
But will we be able, can you also look into the dimming? Because I know there's equipment that does that.
For the lights right
Yeah.
now that we're trying to
No,
order?
for the LEDs, when you're looking at, like
If we-
retrofitting
town.
a
If you
roof-
convert.
Right, if you convert.
For all of town?
In town.
Yeah, for all of town.
Certainly wouldn't do it
Okay,
for
well, I'm
But
just
we could
wondering,
s-
because the six could potentially be ordered like later this week or early next week, but if I need to go back now and look at dimming, it will take longer to do that, right? So that's what I'm trying to clarify, if it'd be for like the larger project or if it's for the immediate.
I would do it for the immediate, only from the aspect that if it turns out it doesn't work well, then we don't do the whole town. Otherwise, we decide to
Can we
do,
do that though with cars, for the SHA? if
No,
it's dimmed?
yeah, you're talking about Strathmore. I wouldn't touch that at all. I can
don't-
see in town where it might be a benefit to have the two modes, but on Strathmore, I wouldn't.
I don't know,
wouldn't-
because
I wouldn't deal with that.
Again, Phil, we get into this game of what does SHA specify
Yes.
as the constant lumens per square foot in the.
Sure.
Yeah. And the need to keep that steady as opposed to having it vary depending on whatever factor we determine.
God forbid anything would happen.
yeah.
I just, I very specifically remember they were very, very demanding and saying it has to meet the spec.
Sure.
And they wouldn't consider an alternative. I think in today's climate, they might, if we had a compelling case.
Right.
So just, I'm not suggesting we not ask that question, but we need to be aware that we may not be the ones that get to decide.
I think we should at least ask to find out, because
Yeah,
it may be
I-
prohibitively
I
expensive.
agree.
And we were just discussing this might all be good for part of the 2021 budget as well.
Mhm.
Andrea, on a different topic, could I just ask that you put on the listserv, the announcement of the change of the date for the District 18 meeting? Because I think some residents may not realize that it
Yeah,
was
It's
moved out
already
of
there,
December.
because I actually looked
It's-
it up. It's right on the front page, and it's also on the calendar.
Did it go out through
No, I mean
GPML?
through the
That's what you
listserv
meant?
is what I
Oh, the
meant.
listserv, I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
just to make sure that all residents
Yeah, consent.
know.
For January 6th.
Oh, I wanted to go back and revisit the house in Kenilworth for 2 seconds. Can we deny or they would have to come to us for a demolition permit, right? And can we
Yeah.
do anything about that, or we basically just have to give it to them? Because if they were gonna tear the house down, if Freddie Mac were to come in and say, we're gonna tear this house down, we would have to issue them a demolition permit, is my understanding, right?
Yeah, I think,
Or we
right,
could-
Stephen?
Typically, we have
Any house.
granted those, but
Yeah.
a lot of the idea is that it could be a delay, so we had one, it was one of the, maybe not a tech built, but one of the more early prefab houses was torn down, so there was a little bit of a delay before that was taken down. We were able to get like some historic artifacts out of that house
Yeah,
before
that's where
it
you're
went
going.
away, but it's mostly been
Yeah.
the result of it.
Is that where you're going, Phil? Is that where
Oh,
you're
I was
going,
gonna
Phil?
discourage, as a way of
preserve some of the-
discouraging somebody from tearing it down versus trying to keep it as a historic house. I mean, it certainly might be easier in some people's eyes just to flatten the thing and start with a clean slate, you
I
know?
hate to have people running in there and taking some very nice architectural features.
If there are any left.
The siding and everything's all been taken off and
There,
Inside
what
is stripped
about
out.
that there was some mantels and nice hearths?
maybe there.
They just got the whole house.
I don't know. I knew they were preserving some because some
Not
of
with-
us
Not with the
inquired.
windows gone, they're not preserving it.
Well, that's what I mean. I wonder if people have gone in and taken things out. Okay.
It
Are
would be
we-
good to find out what's the
Yeah.
process if they do consider raising the building, what recourse this town has.
Well, I think
Yeah.
they gotta get the permit from us.
And did
to
you say it's
tear it
been
down.
condemned by the county?
It's been
It's
condemned, yeah.
And
Been condemned and
It's
it's
condemned.
foreclosure.
And it's in pre-foreclosure.
But you can still correct a condemned house, right? I mean, you're
Yes,
not
that's what I
forced
was
to tear it
wondering.
down.
What does
There's
that
I
trigger?
think 4 violations, 2 violations with the county Housing and Community Affairs and 2 violations with Permitting Services. And both of the county staff are working with the person I spoke with, who works for a firm called Guardian. They have a notice that's on the front of the house, to make sure that Guardian understands what those violations are. It's Guardian's job to try, at this point, they work on behalf of the mortgage servicer to try to secure the property and make sure that it's safe and address some of those violations. They won't be, one of the violations with permitting services is that the permit's over a year old. Obviously, that one's not one that will be addressed, but the other 3 will be. I know that there was some question with the Housing and Community Affairs county staff person I talked to. She didn't feel like her contractor could probably do anything related to the ditch, which is why the ditch hasn't been safely dealt with yet. That's more on the permitting side, I think. So, and all of these are in the court process as well.
But those are also part of why it was condemned.
Yeah, I don't know exactly what her determinations were.
So I guess really where I was trying to go was to say that there is still hope. It's not just something that basically it's so rotted and bad. I mean, I know you don't know the answer to that, but there may still be hope for it, rather than just structurally, rather than having to say, oh, we got to tear it down.
Partly depends on who buys it.
Right.
They heard that there was interest and they would tear it down. Okay, are we all through? We all through?
Yeah.
Andrew?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay, thank you. This adjourns. Thank you.